Now I will introduce Marie-Claire Phélippeau. Dr. Marie-Claire Phélippeau has been a professor of English and American literature in classe préparatoire littéraire in Montpellier, France. After an initial research in the representation of paradise in travel literature and utopias, she produced a French translation of Thomas More's Last Things. She also studied the problem of sin, death, and the afterlife in Thomas More for her doctoral dissertation at the Paris Sorbonne Nouvelle, and has published her research in a book called Pour l'amour du ciel in 2012. Now retired from teaching, she is the editor of the journal Moreana and the vice president of the society Amici Tomei Mori. She has recently explored More's tower works written while in prison in the 14 months before his execution in order to look for the mystic in him. Let's hear what she has found.
Thank you. As you rightly said, Professor Simon, Thomas More was in fact preoccupied with heaven, I would say, not only afterlife, but heaven and the fear of hell from the very beginning. In 1522, he wrote The Last Things and already mentioned that we should try to think of death every single day and every single minute of our lives in order to secure heaven. So that's why I wrote, after my research, this book called For Heaven's Sake, in French first, but Pour l'amour du ciel. And discussing with other people from the Center for Renaissance, for Thomas More studies, we tried to consider Thomas More's tower works, and my contribution was, let's see if he's really a mystic. Because he's been called a mystic by some, and he's been denied being a mystic by others. So here's my paper. So I started with Thomas More, the mystic, and I ended up with a question mark. But you'll see. Was Thomas More mystic? This is not the first time the question has been raised, if only incidentally. And answers have varied greatly, covering the whole spectrum, between an absolute negative to the definite affirmation of G.K. Chesterton. He was a mystic and a martyr. When after Elton's sentence that More's proved conclusively that he was never a mystic, Richard Marius writes, More wanted to be a mystic but lacked the gift. It appeared necessary to seriously review the case. So I propose to start by looking at a number of definitions of mysticism, which you will also find on your papers here, because they do vary, and this is also an issue today. And we'll then compare More's writings to those of the well-known mystics that we had around, perhaps. Thus, we might discover if, or to what extent, we can call More a mystic. Definition of mysticism first. The concept is seriously being questioned in academic circles today, however, not within Catholicism. The New Catholic Encyclopedia uses Jean Gerson's definition, very old one, and I will forget the Latin. Mystical theology is knowledge of God by experience, arrived at through the embrace of unifying love. Thomas Corbishley, the author of this entry, specifies that mystical theology is to be distinguished from natural theology, which enables man to arrive at some knowledge of God by natural reason. Note that Gerson, who wrote the definition in the early 15th century, refers to mystical theology and not to mysticism. It was not until the 16th and 17th centuries that the term mysticism became used as a substantive, as a noun. Since the Catholic Encyclopedia's definition cannot apply to all religions, theoreticians of mysticism today try a broader definition to cater for everybody. For instance, Wolfson, if I note, quotation 2. Mysticism relates to the capacity of the human mind to imagine what cannot be imagined and to think what cannot be thought. God's not in the picture here. Wolfson comments, this definition satisfies both the essentialist claim that there is something we can identify as the unchanging essence of the mystical and the constructivist claim that the mystical elements need to be studied and evaluated within specific cultural contexts. However, most scholars are reluctant to abandon the idea of union with the divine and with some ultimate reality. So, in an effort to embrace polytheistic and non-theistical religions, such as Buddhism, for example, another one, Zenner, quotation 3, writes that mysticism means union with some principle or other. It is therefore a unitive experience with someone or something other than oneself. Above all that, the debate about mysticism today stumbles especially against the denial of the reality of any mystical experience, such as visions of the divine, voices. We do not believe in voices anymore. We think this has been history and never existed. Stigmas, levitation, or the feeling of another presence. Because the supernatural does not exist in modernity, some scholars tried to account for the ancient descriptions of mystical experience in rational ways, as hallucinations or exegetical enterprise. However, this move to dismiss the supernatural conversation by rationalizing it has not increased our knowledge of ancient mysticism, although it does speak to modern perceptions that mysticism just cannot exist. But instead of bluntly denying the existence of mysticism on the ground that mystical experiences are not rational, I propose we restrict our study to a Christian definition of the concept. So then more can be in the picture. One that does not consider the wonder, but the depth of the mystical experience. The French theologian Max Huot de Longchamp accounts for the etymology of the word. Quotation 4. Mysticism is this very special awareness of the mystery of Christ, he writes, and basing his final definition on the medieval mystic Tauler, he explains, the word mystical has lost all precise meaning since Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the Romantics have applied it to the irrational aspect which often qualifies anything religious. We will restrict the word, says Huot de Longchamp, to its most classic Christian meaning, that of an experience of the perception of God, as it were, a veritable feast for the soul on the occasion of Christ's intimate presence. So from all those definitions, the one common and essential aspect inherent in the mystical experience is its transcendence. I think we should stay with this idea of transcendence. It seems, therefore, that one cannot call a saintly person a mystic if that person does not admit to having felt some exceptional and secret intimacy with the divine. Otherwise, it might be too easy to be one day a mystic and the next day no. So, is Thomas More mystic? So how about Thomas More now? Well, Thomas More mentions the union with God as a wish, even as a yearning to be fulfilled after death. The great mystics clearly state that they have experienced that union during their lives. Perhaps the most radical experience is to be found in Saint Catherine of Siena, quotation 5, who, on accompanying a young man to the scaffold, reveals she has actually seen Christ. She writes, then was seen God and man, as might the clearness of the sun be seen, and he stood wounded and received the blood. Mystics usually insist on the transformation they have undergone following that experience and of the joy that ensued. The feast we mentioned above, Teresa of Avila, in her very personal style, confesses to enjoying a special state which gives her los gustos de la gloria, a foretaste of the glory of heaven. Quotation 6. You have, for Teresa of Avila, you have both the original Spanish and the translation to English. Everything that takes place now in this state brings the very greatest consolation. The tears which God now sends flow with joy. Though we feel them, they are not the result of any efforts of our own. For the soul is already ascending out of its wretched state, and some little knowledge of the blissfulness of glory. For More, Thomas More, such an encounter with the divine can only take place after death. Quotation 7. For since the very substance essential of all, the celestial joy, for since the very substance essential of all the celestial joy standeth in blessed beholding the glorious Godhead face to face, there may no man presume or look to attain it in this life. For God hath so said himself, non videbit me homo et vivet, there shall no man here living behold me, from Exodus. Mystical theology means that knowledge of God is acquired not through reason, but on the occasion of an experience that is felt as some kind of union with the divine, which more yearns for when he expresses many times his longing to be dissolved in Christ. Bernard of Clairvaux has emphasized the same idea of heavenly nuptials, absorption in Christ, and Teresa of Avila has the same comparable image of being toda engolfada in Christ. But I will skip quotation 8 for you to come back later when you want to pray, perhaps. More did not deny there were mystics who enjoyed a special treatment on earth. We may even imagine that he would have liked to be one of those special servants that he mentions. He does mention mystics who have had experience, but never himself. I'll only quote quotation 9. I'll only quote the bold letters here. When he refers to his lack of such experimental taste, given by God only to some of his special servants, who then are fortunate enough to receive an earnest penny of their whole reward after in heaven. And I love that expression. Did you have your earnest penny? I did not, but some have had it. So More's use of the adjective experimental can be understood as a reference to the mystical experience, seen as an earnest penny or a foretaste of the heavenly reward, something that, unfortunately, seems not to have been granted him. I would therefore suggest that Thomas More cannot be called a mystic. So, of course, I disagree with others. Since the mystical experience or union with God is always mentioned with him as a wish, as something extremely desirable to be achieved in heaven, but never as an experience which has actually taken place during his lifetime. Other elements may help us understand why More could not be a mystic. In most of today's historiographical analyses, mysticism is understood as an historical phenomenon that happened in a given time of history. You cannot be a mystic today, I'm sorry. The Rhineland mystics in the 13th and 14th century, then the Spanish mystics in the 16th and 17th century. Michel de Certeau, who specializes in the subject, points out that the phenomenon tended to take place in times of decline of the church, in the church authority, and of corruption in the clergy or in the regular orders. The mystical experiences are more often found in subjects whose sociological background bears some common features, like ruined aristocrats, humiliated families. That's the case for Teresa of Avila, for example, people who experience familial or social regression. These tended to be more mystics, or the mystics tended to be among them, rather. Thomas More did not fall into a category that was susceptible of producing mystics, therefore. He was an active layman, coming from a prosperous London family, and although the situation of the church preoccupied him seriously, the Reformed Church had not yet been accepted as the national church. There was no such heavy decline of the church, perhaps, or, well, at least it did not influence him in this way. As often pointed out, More lived at the cusp of two eras, but the new order would be established only after his death. However, there is such a mystical appeal in some of More's writings that this research would not have taken place without some suspicion of More's mysticism. This is something that we recurrently suggest. And indeed, had we been bent on declaring More a mystic, we would have agreed. I would have found elements like Richard Czech, and I would have agreed with Richard Czech's definition of mysticism when he declared, quotation 10, mysticism is a direct intuitional experience of God through unifying love, but it does not require an ecstatic experience. This is where we disagree. That is, that kind of experience which transcends personality and characteristically produces preternatural phenomena. The mystical experience, continues Scheck, can be taken, as I here take it to be, simply the highest mode or expression of the spiritual life. In that sense, More is a mystic for Scheck. So it is true that Thomas More, like the great mystics, meditates on the Passion, on the Eucharists, on the love of God. He even writes lengthily about it and spends probably nights thinking about it. But in his meditations, we always find a pastoral concern. This is, to me, what is really the key here. He does not speak about himself only, he speaks about what you should do, because I'm talking to you about this. His spiritual writings are not the typical flow of mystical literature expressing gratitude for the to the divine for being singled out and granted revelations. Even in his most moving passages, for example, the sadness of Christ, De Tristitia Christi, for instance, More writes for an audience, giving lessons, inciting his readers, inciting the bishops to better obey their conscience, inciting the readers to believe and pray, and to reform their souls. More writes in the pastoral and not in the mystical mode. However, there are mystical aspects in him. The 16th century layman proved he was capable of the most profoundly religious reflections. He did not shun from embarking on scriptural exegesis in which mystical accents can be heard. Besides, for those who knew him intimately, these two aspects, his ascetic life, he wore a hair shirt under his garments, and his contempt of the world, too, probably ranked as the most prominent features of his mystical disposition. When after a whole year imprisoned in the tower, More reports to his daughter on his interrogation before the council, he exposes the very program of a mystical life. To Cromwell, the king's secretary, who demanded he took the oath so he might be abroad in the world again among other men, as he had been before, Cromwell says, More gave this answer, quotation 11. I shortly, after the inward affection of my mind, answered for a very truth that I would never meddle in the world again, to have the world given me. And to the remnant of the matter I answered in effect as before, showing that I had fully determined with myself neither to study nor meddle with any matter of this world, but that my whole study should be upon the passion of Christ and mine own passage out of this world. That sounds very mystical, certainly. More had elsewhere prayed God to help him set at naught all the riches of this world, demonstrating the same contemptus mundi that mystics practice and preach. Teresa of Avila, quotation 12, comes very near that aim when she writes, To me it seems to be nothing else but a death, as it were, to all the things of this world, and a fruition of God. Mystics have traditionally recommended solitude. Well, the cell in which More has been confined, although a condition he cannot escape, seems to afford him the solitude necessary for his program of meditation. To meditate on the Passion was Bernard of Clairvaux's recommendation, quotation 13, so it behoves us, if we would have Christ for a frequent guest, to fill our hearts with faithful meditations on the mercy he showed in dying for us. Seems to have been written by Thomas More. More devotes 2 treatises to that meditation, and following St. Bernard, lays emphasis on Christ's humanity. There have been many very moving pages on that topic, especially since the Devotio Moderna with Jean Gerson and A Kempis had encouraged the appeal to the feeling of compassion for suffering Christ. Thomas More very eloquently follows suit, although in a fairly sober way, choosing reasoning rather than descriptions. When More imagines Jesus at the Mount of Olives, before his Passion, he writes that, horrified at the prospect of such cruel suffering, drawing eagerly nearer and nearer, Jesus woke up his disciples, and he chose to enhearten them by the example of his own sorrow, his own sadness. We have no other words than sorrow and sadness here. As Gary Haupt remarked, More reminds us that the Word is the image. The Word is an image, and More doesn't need descriptions. The sadness of Christ, with its exceptional power in evoking not so much the actions and the violence that caused Christ's passion, but the anguish and terror of Jesus' state of mind, can rank among the great spiritual voices of Christianity. You will have to compare with Teresa of Avila's meditation in quotation 14, which I won't read out here, and see how she lays emphasis on the power of silence. If silence is so important in meditation, it's also the only answer for mystics faced with exceptional experiences, ecstasy, or other abnormal phenomena. In these circumstances, although they would like to impart their experience with their readers, their reaction is invariably to state the ineffability of what they have been through. It's impossible to describe, ineffable. We have the same attitude in St. John of the Cross, when he expresses his inability to communicate the effect of his contemplation, which provides what he calls wisdom of love. When Thomas More, imprisoned in the tower, also mentions the ineffability of spiritual truth, this truth do not seem to be the result of a revelation through feeling, but the result of much thinking, much reasoning, and much meditation. My last paragraph will be on More's idea of heaven. In a dialogue of comfort, More is again at a loss for words when he wishes to convince his readers to the unspeakable joys of heaven, much like John of the Cross when he expresses the delight of heavenly nuptials. For More, this delight is to be enjoyed only after death, as we saw, of course. However, his spiritual writings, especially his tower works, offer a number of similarities with the most eloquent mystics, as we have seen just a few. Those he had read, like Bernard of Clairvaux and Catherine of Siena, as well as those that were to come a few decades after him in Spain. More's most mystical passages are to be found in his insistent appeal to the meditation on heaven. And as you said, from 1522, he asked you to meditate on hell, heaven, and afterlife, in which he develops themes that are the traditional rewards of a mystical life: beatific vision and impatience of union with God, often simply expressed as impossible to describe, since our dull, worldly wits are not able to conceive so much as a shadow of the right imagination. And I'll let you discover this in the full passage in quotation 15. But Thomas More has his own conception of heaven. The idea of the beatific vision, so traditional in the Middle Ages, where you just were happy by contemplating God and not moving, has been revived. It has been revived to a certain extent, but when heaven was essentially represented, as I said, as a contemplation of God. But it was also emphasized by Augustine in The City of God, which More knew so well. When More devotes a whole chapter to heaven in a dialogue of comfort, he borrows St. Paul's word that also about the beatific vision. Now we see things imperfectly, as in a cloudy mirror, but then we will see everything with perfect clarity. And he exhorts the common sinful man to reform his earthly desires and meditate on heaven, of which though we will only have a glimmering and an imperfect vision. But following Bernard of Clairvaux, More shows an impatience with the union that is to take place in heaven. However, besides the traditional expression of joy and delight, More's paradise, and this is what is new, feels real and feels possible, assuming an earthly and a human quality. Thus, in his 1535 letter to his friend Antonio Bonvisi, More shows his assurance of soon, he's going to die the next day, soon reaching that desired place where no wall shall dissever us. They were in two different cells, prison cells. There where no wall shall dissever us, where no porter shall keep us from talking together, but that we may have the fruition of the eternal joy with God. And when he writes to his daughter that they both should pray, that we may merrily meet in heaven, when he assures her that he would not like to postpone the date of his execution, More seems to have been granted the courage he admired in the martyrs, and the certainty that God will give his holy martyrs that suffer for his sake many a special kind of joy. More's exceptional hope, his meditation, and his pastoral writing on heaven, his last statements showing a serene expectation of his union with Christ, all this defines a man who may never have had any mystical experience, as we have defined it, but who, through reasoning, reading, and praying, has shown a rare degree of faith in his life after death. Thomas More, therefore, I would conclude, cannot be classified as a mystic per se, since he never confesses to any mystical experience, such as revealed by the writings of the great mystics. However, he has behaved as one, and his meditations are akin to those of the great figures of Christianity. The prisoner in the tower, as his execution drew nearer, developed a fascinating, and if secret, then mystical, personal relationship with the divine, which becomes more intense, more palpable, and more certain as death approached, accrediting something of the mystic in him. The Renaissance author that he was might not have received on earth that earnest penny of a whole reward after in heaven, but he undoubtedly managed to share his exceptional hope through his writings with us. And that's it.